It's Saturday night in downtown Colorado Springs. The bars are slammed, the streets are rowdy, and patrol officers like Mark Compt are gearing up for a busy night.
It wasn't unusual to have 3 or 4 fights in the evening. Nothing real serious, but it usually required a pretty heavy police presence.
Right on cue, Compt's radio crackles with the report of a disturbance on Nevada Avenue, downtown's main drag.
At that time, I was only a couple blocks away, so I radioed dispatch and told them I'd respond.
10-4, I'm coming from Cooper and 5th.
The dispatcher informs Compt that there's also an ambulance on the scene, loading up what appears to be one of the brawlers.
He was bleeding from the mouth and the nose. The ambulance, obviously noting that this victim was in dire distress, did a scoop and run. They picked the person up. This guy needs critical care immediately.
As Compt arrives on the scene, the responding officer informs him 2 of the suspected brawlers have fled down a nearby alley.
What do you got?
We got 2 males going up this way. They're suspects.
What are they wearing?
They're wearing blue shirts and blue jeans. They're involved.
Got it.
Compt peels after them. Soon, his headlights fall on 2 young men.
They looked at the cruiser and turned and took off running.
Let's go.
They were heading right towards the building, so I just cut them off with the cruiser.
Put your hands behind your back. Do it now. Don't move.
Patting down each young man, Compt finds no weapons, but both suspects appear to have blood on their clothing.
So I placed them in the backseat of police cars and brought them back to the scene. My intention was just to drop them off to another cruiser, see if there's anything else the officers on scene needed.
That's when Officer Compt receives an update, one that takes this case to a new level.
And we received a call from an officer who went to the hospital who told us that the victim had passed from his injuries.
Which means this standard issue street fight has become a possible murder.
Once the word was received that this is a homicide investigation, the officers called for more help at that time, especially from the Major Crimes Unit.
Across town, homicide detective Lt.Joe Kenda is driving home after another long night at work, when his captain calls and tells him it just got a little longer.
Go ahead for Kenda.
The basic information we're provided is that there is a fight in the street. Unknown motive, unknown circumstance as to how the fight occurred. Then one man is beaten to death, literally. I bring the call team to the scene to see what we know.
Within minutes, Kenda and his men are on the scene.
Lieutenant?
Gentlemen, how you doing? What do we got?
Where Officer Compt informs them he just found a 3rd potential suspect.
He had some blood on his shirt as well, just like the other suspects that were involved. So I went over and contacted him, and he gave me the dumbfounded look, like, what are you talking to me for? I didn't ask him about it. I just, observed it, and then I put him in the back seat of the cruiser.
With 3 persons of interest now in custody, Kenda surveys the scene for more details.
It is extreme violence without provocation. And our job is to find out who in this group are responsible for murder. There's a large blood stain where the victim had been laying. First question is the obvious one. What happened here?
Is there any weapon used?
No, sir. It looks like he was beat to death.
The victim died as a result of blunt force trauma, multiple blows to the outside of the skull. The victim also had a lacerated liver. All of his ribs were broken. He had a punctured lung. This man has been injured from the waist up in every possible square inch of his body. He would have died from internal bleeding had he not died from the head injury.
The scope and severity of the wounds suggest there were multiple assailants. But based on the slim facts, it's possible the victim may have been killed in self-defense.
You're still kind of wondering what led to this. What's the motive for this kind of beating? Did he start the fight? Were the people originally defending themselves?
Is there anything that he did that caused any of this to happen to him? You need to find that out. You need to find that out quickly.
However the brawl started, the sheer brutality suggests it was more than a run-in between complete strangers. It might be personal.
This is not a street fight. It is a street attack. This is an incredibly savage attack. How does that happen? What's the dynamic involved?
To get a better picture of what happened, Kenda needs to talk to eyewitnesses. Officers point to a bloodied young man sitting on the sidewalk and suggest that he had the best view of the attack, right in the middle of it.
Is that the victim right there?
Yes, sir.
All right, I'll go talk to him. Thanks, guys.
Well, that guy was with the guy that got beat up. And they point out a 23-year-old man named Joseph Reeves. We approached Mr. Reeves. Were you with this guy? Yes. And who is he? His name is Lane Schmidtke.
Joseph Reeves explains that he and Lane were close friends.
Everybody likes him. He's married with twin daughters. Reeves has met his wife and his 2 children before. He thinks Lane's a good guy.
The description of Lane Schmidtke as a mild-mannered family man only raises more questions about his death.
This person died a very painful death. What exactly is the cause of this? What's the provocation? What's the motive on these people? Or is it something that just happened?
The search for answers would soon bring Kenda and his men face to face with an unlikely set of suspects and plunge the question of motive further into mystery.
Why did this happen? I'm only interested in why, if it leads me to who.
In the early morning hours of September 22nd, 1991, Lt.Joe Kenda and his team are standing at the scene of a bizarre fatality. Lane Schmidtke, a mild-mannered family man, has been beaten to death on a downtown sidewalk, and police are at a loss to explain why.
It was tragic. A nice kid who was married, had twin daughters. You wonder in an investigation like this, what happened? Why did this happen?
You know, there was not a reason in the world to think that he would have run into trouble there.
Officers have hauled 3 persons of interest downtown for interrogation. All of them were found with blood on their clothes. Still, Kenda knows it's not enough to charge them with a crime, much less murder.
You're in a melee fight, in this case. People are very close together. People who are maybe not even involved might wind up with blood on them. We need more.
For now, Kenda is focusing his attention on Joseph Reeves, a survivor of the brawl and a self-proclaimed friend of the victim.
How you doing? I'm Joe Kenda, detective working on this. So, tell me what happened.
Reeves says, we were in town this evening. We decided we were going to go get something to eat.
As they approached the corner of Pikes Peak and Nevada Avenue, a crowd of young people allegedly started harassing the 2 friends.
Look, man, we're just trying to get home, okay?
Home better be that way, because you ain't coming on our
Man,
block.
look.
This group of kids confronted them, said this is our sidewalk, our corner. I could see that in my mind being valid, because that's the way it was. It didn't take anything to provoke a fight.
Come and disrespect us on our time.
Reeves and Lane tried to ignore the trash talk.
And we need to go and check them.
But before Reeves knew it, the threats turned to shoves.
No, you're not trying to get anywhere, man. Come on.
Then punches.
Hey, guys, get off.
And they seemed to be coming from every direction.
Schmidtke gets punched in the face, and he goes down on the ground. He is being punched, meaning Reeves. He backs up to try to extricate himself from the fight.
But once Reeves was out of harm's way, he realized that his friend was still under attack.
They got him on the ground and just proceeded to kick him and beat him. And it didn't take long for him not to make any defensive moves.
At that point, Joseph Reeves says he heard sirens, and as quickly as it started, the attack came to an end.
He sees an ambulance come up, and the ambulance people get out and come over, and the fight stops.
It's a disturbing account, one that suggests Schmidtke was attacked and killed without any provocation whatsoever. But Kenda wonders if Schmidtke's assailants could have been settling an old score.
Why is it that these kids are so agitated? We're trying to figure out if they all know each other. Is there a reason for them to see Schmidtke and attack him as a result?
Kenda presses Reeves for answers, as well as the identities of the attackers. But Reeves can't even remember how many there were, much less recall their identities.
He's being assaulted. He can't see these people, not clearly. And if he does, he doesn't remember what he saw.
Reeves may not be able to ID a suspect, but he claims there's something Kenda should know about the victim. Something that quickly turns the situation from bad to worse.
Tell me about your buddy.
We're in the Army together.
You guys are in the Army right now?
Yes, sir.
Reeves tells us we're both in the Army, 1st to the 12th Infantry, 4th Infantry Division, Fort Carson. How can this be? How can we kill one of the people who's supposed to defend us?
For detectives, the military connection poses another difficult question. Was Lane Schmidtke assaulted because he was an officer?
It could have been a motive for the incident, and that's one area we have to look at.
But if Schmidtke's occupation was a factor, his fellow soldier is at a loss to explain why.
Reeves says that they are attacked without provocation. They are both simultaneously assaulted. That's all he knows.
With no further questions for Reeves, Kenda finds a new eyewitness, 20-year-old Dan Davis.
He has long blonde hair, kind of a surfer dude kind of kid.
You witnessed this fight?
Yeah, I was hanging out over here with some buddies just having a couple.
Davis says he's not so sure the crowd on the corner was as aggressive as Reeves made it out to be. They weren't rival soldiers, or even a bunch of street toughs looking for a fight. They were teenagers from Fountain Fort Carson High School.
Most of these kids, they came from good backgrounds. It was surprising they would be involved in something like this.
According to Dan Davis, he'd witnessed the kids socializing on Nevada Avenue earlier that evening.
The kids refer to it as the Ave. That's where everybody goes. There are girls present, there are boys present. The music is blaring.
Let's go. Put it up for the team. Yeah!
Everybody's doing what kids do, particularly when they've had a few drinks.
Davis goes on to tell Kenda that around 11:30 a fight broke out. So he tried to stop it, the only way he knew how.
He yelled cops, knowing that when you yell cops, people stop doing what they're doing and run off.
Kenda asks Davis if he can identify any of the kids involved, but he's not much more help than Sergeant Reeves was.
He didn't know who was in the fight, he just knew he wasn't in it. Since we had no evidence to the contrary, we let him go.
It's a good chance I'll be calling you again.
Yes, sir.
All right?
I'm going.
Frustrated, Kenda turns to gathering hard evidence. He has forensics sweep the scene and take samples from every drop of blood they find.
There was a great deal of blood at the scene, not only in the area where the victim was laying, but also up on the sidewalk. They did take samples of that blood for a couple of reasons, to see if any of that blood belonged to the victim, or if that blood belonged to any of the suspects.
While the blood evidence is being collected, Kenda heads to the station to speak with the 3 young men in custody.
They have blood on their clothing, blood on their person. The next step is to see what they are willing to say or what they do say about that event.
Kenda starts with the blood-covered suspect who wasn't caught fleeing the scene. 16-year-old junior, Sean Stansel.
He has no criminal history, but he's a kid who is a student at Fountain High School, who is an athlete.
You would not think that he would be the type of kid who would be involved in this type of activity.
Beyond his squeaky clean record, Sean's background indicates that he's the type of kid who would want to be a soldier, not the type who would want to beat one up.
His father is in the Army. This is totally out of character for Sean Stansel.
Sean explains that he was hanging out with his girlfriend when the fight broke out. Without thinking, he jumped in, but only to play the part of peacemaker.
John tried to break up the fight. This would account for any blood transfer that could have been found on his clothing.
Kenda wants to know whose blood is on Sean's t-shirt. Sean is certain it belongs to one of Schmidtke's attackers, but Sean is adamant that he's not one of them, nor does he know who they are.
You didn't see who was punching, kicking?
I don't know, it's just I couldn't tell who was doing what. There's just so many people.
He could say there were people there. He could see color and clothing, but he was not able to positively identify a potential suspect.
To Kenda, Sean Stansel's story could ring true, but he'll have to confirm that the blood on Sean's shirt isn't Lane Schmidtke's.
This man has been repeatedly punched and kicked. The first blow produces blood. The second blow disperses it. There is going to be medium velocity blood spatter coming off of his body and on to the people assaulting him.
After collecting Sean's clothing and delivering it to the lab for analysis, Kenda turns his attention to the two other potential suspects, Kevin Moore and Anthony Phoenix.
They're both 18 years old. They both go to Fountain High School. They are athletes on the football team. The blood in their clothing would indicate that it was appropriate they got arrested.
First up for questioning is the school's star quarterback, Anthony Phoenix.
Mr. Phoenix has never been in jail, never been arrested for anything. But here he is, in our custody now. So what are you doing, Anthony? What are you doing downtown?
According to Anthony, he was just hanging out on Nevada Avenue like everyone else.
I was just out having fun, man, chilling with my friends.
As for how the blood got on his clothes, Anthony claims he wound up in the brawl by accident.
Someone's blood could have swung off and landed on my shirt.
He heard a bunch of noise from a group of people, and he walked to see what was happening with that group of people, and at that point, he found himself in the middle of a fight.
He did say that he got hit in the back. He spun around and started swinging wildly, blindly, trying to hit anything that may have possibly hit him.
Anthony claims he can't remember exactly who he swung at, but he's positive they were on their feet, and therefore not Lane Schmidtke.
He didn't know who he was fighting, other than it was a large group of people fighting, and that's why he had blood on him.
It's a plausible story, but Kenda isn't convinced. Needing more information, he turns to Phoenix's teammate, Kevin Moore.
He's a linebacker on the football team. He has the physical size to prove it. He's 6'2", muscular, very good shape. So what happened, Kevin?
Kevin's story is the haziest of all. He tells Kenda he had one too many drinks that night and passed out in a friend's car.
He actually said that he was asleep in the back of a car, and he was awakened, I believe, by somebody who said that, hey, Anthony's involved in a fight, go stop it.
What?
According to Kevin, he bulldozed his way through the crowd and dragged his friend Anthony Phoenix away from the brawl.
And that's how he gets the blood on him.
And what happened then? He says, somebody said the cops are coming. So we ran. And then what? Well, we got arrested.
Kenda is skeptical. Each of the young men in custody claims to have been sucked into the fight almost by accident, and they all deny laying a finger on Lane Schmidtke.
So you look at this in total, and you say, what is this? And you're back to the phase of who's lying and who isn't.
For Kenda, there's only one surefire way to find out. He collects the bloody clothing from Anthony Phoenix and Kevin Moore and drops them off at the lab as well.
If we're able to determine that the blood, for example, on Kevin Moore's shoes is most likely that of the victim, then that's pretty damning evidence as to where Kevin's feet were at the time that victim was on the ground.
But with so much blood evidence to analyze, it could be weeks or months before tests are complete. With a dead soldier on his hands and 3 high schoolers in custody, Kenda wonders if this case could get any worse. Just then, he receives an alarming phone call, one that reveals not only a new suspect, but the chilling promise of even more bloodshed.
Somebody threatened her and said she better not tell the cops what she saw, or she would be next.
Army Specialist Lane Schmidtke has been beaten to death in the streets of Colorado Springs. And Lt.Joe Kenda is no closer to understanding what happened or who is responsible.
You have witnesses, all kids, all more than willing to lie to you, all more than willing to minimize their friends' involvement. It is a cobweb of information.
Kenda still hasn't ruled out the possibility that this was more than some chance encounter that turned deadly. He needs a new witness, someone who can connect the dots between Lane Schmidtke and his alleged attackers.
Kind of wondered what else was out there, what really led this to happen. Was there anybody else involved that we just don't know about?
No sooner have detectives started mulling over that notion than Kenda receives a frantic phone call from a woman whose daughter attends Fountain Fort Carson High. She says her daughter may know something about Lane Schmidtke's death, but she's afraid to come forward, with good reason.
Do you know the nature of the threats?
He just said if she told.
She says somebody called my daughter yesterday at the house and threatened her and said she better not tell the cops what she saw, or she would be next.
Is that hearsay? Yeah, but it gives us something to work with. We have to then go investigate that.
Kenda's next move is to question the young girl who was threatened, Tanya Starr.
So tell us about this threat.
I got a phone call this morning from a friend of mine.
Tanya was a young female Fountain Fort Carson student, and that was pretty consistent with the crowd at the scene.
And we say, well, you were there, weren't you? I was there. What'd you see?
Tanya claims that it's not so much what she saw, but what she heard. After the fight was over, she shared a ride home with a boy from school. And what he said left Tanya terrified.
After the fight, she heard him say, "So we killed that dude. So what?" Really?
It's the closest thing to a confession detectives have heard yet, and enough to bump this unknown male to the top of the suspect list. Detectives asked Tanya if she can ID the person who made the remark.
His name's Dominic Perea.
She came up with the name of Dominic Perea. Once again, another Fountain Fort Carson High School student.
According to Tanya, Dominic is a 17-year-old senior and a friend of Anthony, Kevin, and Sean. Unlike the 3 kids in custody, however, Dominic has a history of bad behavior.
Dominic, a little bit more of a shaded past, more involved, more prone to physical action, possibly getting involved in fights.
Dominic's past also taught him how to cover his tracks, and he wanted to make sure no one told the police anything, including Tanya.
He basically told me that if I told anyone about the fight that happened, that he would kill me.
She had a conversation with Dominic Perea, and he told her not to mention it, or she could get hurt as a result.
Kenda has heard enough. After wrapping up with Tanya, he and his team set out in search of Dominic Perea.
Now, when you have a threat put forward to a witness, it's important you move with all possible speed to arrest that individual that made that threat.
As with the other young men in custody, Kenda believes the key to determining Dominic's involvement could be trace evidence found in his clothing. Fortunately, witnesses provided a detailed description of what Dominic was wearing the night of the fight.
We have a search warrant for these items of clothing. We want those clothes in the event they contain blood or blood of the victim.
Lieutenant Kenda and his men arrive at the Perea residence, where they sit Dominic down with his mother.
The reason we're here is we have several witnesses to say that you were involved in that fight the other night.
But as they grill him about the incident, Dominic claims he has nothing to confess.
You had nothing to do with the fight itself? What happened?
He denies involvement in the fight. He says he was there, he was downtown, never saw a fight, that's it. Doesn't know anything about it.
Kenda tells Dominic that if he wasn't involved in the assault, then he won't mind handing over the clothes he was wearing.
Where are the clothes you wore that night?
I washed them.
You washed them. Why'd you do that?
I'm kind of a neat freak. I like to keep a tidy house. I do laundry almost every day.
She provided an explanation that her task, her routine with him was he'd come home, throw his clothes on the floor, she would pick them up and clean them.
It's a frustrating setback. Just as they're about to leave, however, Kenda spots one item that wasn't washed.
Sit on your shoe.
But we noticed what looks like blood on one of Dominic's shoes. It's not a lot of blood, but it is blood. You're in the violent crime business, you know blood when you see it. So we take his shoes for evidentiary purpose, terminate the interview, and we place him in custody.
While Dominic's shoes are sent to the crime lab, Dominic is taken to the county lockup. With the blood work still pending, Kenda can't help but wonder if all 4 of the teenagers in custody could be involved in Lane Schmidtke's death. Or were some actually innocent as they claim?
It's not unusual that they would be all together on Nevada Avenue on Saturday night with a little alcohol in their system. Is there a reason for them to be beyond just being kids and having a few drinks?
Little does Kenda realize eyewitness testimony is about to bring the whole hideous picture into focus and bring cops and civilians face to face with the shocking truth.
It was horrible. People were left just holding their hands open and shaking their heads.
It is extreme violence, savage violence. It is almost primal in nature.
Army specialist and young father Lane Schmidtke was fatally beaten in the streets of Colorado Springs. The 4 high school students in custody all maintain they had no part in the soldier's death. But detectives are counting on blood analysis of their clothing to determine who's telling the truth.
If I find the victim's blood on a suspect, it's more than you were just in the area. You were an active member of the party that assaulted Lane Schmidtke.
Even if the blood work ties all 4 suspects to Schmidtke's assault, it still won't answer the million-dollar question.
When Schmidtke and Reeves come by, why do they have to attack them? You have a bunch of kids that weren't known to be real troublemakers. You know, a scrap here and there, nothing like what happened this night.
Lt.Joe Kenda suspects the answer, and possibly more witnesses may be hiding in the halls of Fountain Fort Carson High.
There are 2 things that are very, very important to kids. One is a code of silence. You don't ever tell an adult what's really going on. The second item is loyalty. They have friends, they have enemies. Their version of events will be influenced by their loyalty. They may have a friend involved. They'll identify someone else to protect that friend.
Experience tells Kenda that students who weren't directly involved in the attack, but may have knowledge of how it transpired, are more likely to let down their guard. So Kenda puts in a few calls to Fountain Fort Carson faculty members, telling them to keep their ears open.
We want everybody that we could possibly identify to get to the bottom of the story as to who saw what and who saw who do what.
Detective Kenda, homicide.
The principal at Fountain Fort Carson informs Kenda that he has rounded up a group of female students who claim to have witnessed the crime.
You gotta get all those people, get them identified, get them interviewed, and figure out from those interviews what really happened.
Kenda gathers the students and questions them about the night of the brawl. The girls say it all began when some boys from their school started fighting with two GIs.
Look, man, we're just trying to get home, okay?
Better be that way, because you ain't coming.
Man, look.
Kenda thinks he's heard all of this before, until the girls drop a bombshell.
There were two guys, they were military guys, GIs.
Two different GIs?
Yeah, two different ones.
And this is before the fight?
Yeah, before the fight.
That exchange, those individuals that were involved at that point were not the same two soldiers.
It did not involve Schmidtke, it involved two other guys in a vehicle who had left the area.
This is the first Kenda has heard about a fight with two other GIs. He asks the girls to explain in detail what happened.
They say that two GIs pull up in a car.
Hey, what you ladies doing out here?
They exchange words with some girls, because they, of course, are interested in the girls. And then some boys get involved, and they're telling the GIs to leave their girls alone, and it becomes a little heated. They kick the car these guys are in, and they're yelling at them to get out of there. They drive off. End of contact. End of disturbance.
Trying to steal my girl. What they talking about, man? Anthony Phoenix runs this city.
But the adrenaline hadn't worn off, and the boys were ready to swing at anyone who even looked like a soldier. Then, just minutes later, Schmidtke and Reeves happened to walk down the very same block. The girls noticed the men's military haircuts and sensed there might be trouble.
No, like they were really. Oh, man, come on, let's go this way.
One of the girls in the crowd actually went up to him and said, you know, you might want to cross the street. My friends are in a bad mood. They're being violent, and I don't want to see anybody hurt.
Lane looked at her and said, hey, we're not doing anything. We're just walking up the street. And they advanced into the crowd for the purpose of walking through it.
And that's all Reeves and Schmidtke did. But their appearance alone was enough to set off the boys.
And they were accosted and being yelled at, what are you doing on our street? This is our corner, this is our turf. And then one of the individuals in the crowd approached Lane Schmidtke and struck him. The fight ensued from that point.
It's an eye-opening account, one that finally lends a motive to the assault on Lane Schmidtke. These teenagers wanted revenge on a pair of soldiers, and any two soldiers would do.
By learning about the first confrontation with a soldier this group had, that provides me, in my view, with the impetus for the second attack. These kids are all together, they're functioning as a group, they're angry, they've been drinking. In the words of one girlfriend, they're looking for trouble. The encounter with the first soldier motivates them to have trouble with yet another soldier. And that happened to be Mr. Schmidtke.
But the question remains, who exactly was responsible for the attack on Lane Schmidtke? The girls claim to know the answer.
They may not have all seen the same thing, but they all had enough witness information to positively identify these people.
But there's one name on the list that catches Kenda off guard and sends his men on the hunt for the unlikeliest of killers.
He has no criminal history, but he's moved from 0 to 1,000 miles an hour because we're arresting him for murder.
The search for Lane Schmidtke's killers has led Lt.Joe Kenda and his detectives to Fountain Fort Carson High School, where a group of female students claim to know exactly who killed Schmidtke and why.
They're downtown, on the Ave, as the kids like to say. When all of this takes place, they witness it. They see it happen.
The girls claim a run-in with a different pair of soldiers prompted some high school boys to unleash on the next GIs they saw. which just happened to be Schmidtke and Reeves. Kenda asked the girls which of their guy friends threw the first punch, half expecting the answer to be known bad boy Dominic Perea. But according to the girls, it wasn't Dominic. It was the school's star quarterback, Anthony Phoenix.
Everybody liked Anthony Phoenix, but as the night wore on, he changed. He was looking for some trouble.
They say that Anthony Phoenix was the first guy to hit the victim and knock him down. That Anthony punched him in the face, and down he went.
According to the girls, that's when 3 of Phoenix's friends jumped in.
They say Kevin Moore, Dominic Perea, and Sean Stansel punched and kicked the victim repeatedly in the head and the upper body.
If the girls are telling the truth, then police already have the 4 culprits in custody. But the girls aren't finished. They tell detectives that before the assault was over, 2 more of Phoenix's friends joined in.
They identified 2 people, one being Robert Dean, and the second one being Dan Davis.
It's the first Kenda has heard of 9th grader Robert Dean, but the name Dan Davis immediately rings a bell. Davis was the helpful young man who'd been forthcoming with Kenda at the crime scene.
They had no idea that the person they were talking to was involved in the assault on Schmidtke.
Armed with multiple statements naming Davis as one of the perpetrators, Kenda decides it's time to pay this former Good Samaritan a visit.
People avoid the truth, thinking that the police are going to go away, and they're not going to come back. We have a habit of coming back.
Kenda knocks on Davis's front door. When the suspect answers, they confront him on the spot.
Yeah, remember us?
Hey guys, what's up?
We're the guys you lied to?
It is not difficult at all to deal with a amateur who's being interrogated by the police.
I mean, I was just there. I was just pulling people off.
We have several witnesses that put you there, kicking the people on the ground.
I didn't kick them.
Teenage kid presents no challenge at all. He's going to lie. He's going to lie badly. Then you're going to step on his fingers, and he's going to tell you the truth.
The fight, I was just there trying to break it up.
I was just pulling people off the guy.
Davis quickly offers a confession, but it's not much of one.
Dude, you were kicking the guys.
I kicked him maybe once.
So you were kicking them?
But just once.
His ultimate statement was that when the attack occurred, he was there, but he was down at Schmidtke's feet, kicking around the feet area.
According to Davis, he couldn't possibly have struck a fatal blow to the soldier, which makes him guilty of assault, but not murder. Kenda disagrees.
I might have kicked him just a couple times.
Turn around, put your hands behind your back.
There's no way that could have hurt
Turn
him.
around.
Everybody played a part, but nobody believed they killed anybody. They hit the victim, yes. They kicked the victim, yes, but they might have only done it a couple of times. They don't feel guilt, not over murder. They're just in a fight. But the combination of these blows is a murder. We advise him of his rights. We place him under arrest and put him in jail.
With Davis in custody, Kenda sets out in search of his 6th and final suspect, Robert Dean.
Mr. Dean is only 14 years old, but he's 6 feet tall and he weighs 160 pounds. And he certainly doesn't look like he's 14 years old.
Kenda confronts Dean with the allegations against him. Dean denies everything. But once again, Kenda notices a telltale bit of evidence.
How'd you get the blood on your shoes? That is blood, isn't it?
It's blood.
We see blood on his shoes. We take that for evidence and we jail him.
On April 22nd, 1992, Kenda finally receives the blood work that could prove critical to the case. But the results are mixed.
The shoes worn by Sean Stansel are identified as having the victim's blood on them. The shoes worn by Kevin Moore are identified as having the victim's blood on them. But all of the rest of the blood samples that are found on various people's clothing and shoes are all classified by the laboratory as unknown.
It's a disappointing outcome. But that doesn't stop Kenda from slapping murder charges on all 6 suspects.
The physical evidence is limited, but we have an enormous amount of testimony from a significant number of eyewitnesses who consistently identify the perpetrators involved in the case.
3 were juveniles, 3 were adults. All were charged by the district attorney's office as adults.
Over the following year, each of the 6 defendants is found guilty for crimes ranging from manslaughter to first-degree assault. Dan Davis and Robert Dean are each sentenced to several years probation.
Robert Dean, when he ultimately violated his probation, ended up doing 3 years in DOC.
Kevin Moore is sentenced to 12 years of hard time in prison. Sean Stansel and Dominic Perea receive 16 apiece. The steepest sentence of all is handed down to the young man who started the fight, star quarterback Anthony Phoenix.
Anthony was ultimately convicted of second-degree murder and was sentenced to 24 years in prison. I think justice was served in this case. I don't think anybody really intended to kill anybody that night, but their consequences caused the death of somebody that night.
To this day, the murder of Lane Schmidtke, a respected soldier and loving father, carries a chilling reminder that murder can claim the life of anyone, anytime, anywhere.
Mob violence, group violence, it is a rare thing. But when it happens, it's certainly a reminder that we haven't advanced very far as a civilization. How does a group of seemingly intelligent people become a pack of hyenas in a matter of 30 minutes? I don't know. I only know about the result. But when you see that kind of behavior...
The phone rang at 2:17 a.m., and the sound cut through the quiet like a blade, because in this town nothing ever rang at 2:17 unless something had gone terribly wrong, unless someone had seen something they couldn't unsee, unless a night that should have passed unnoticed was about to be frozen in time forever. The dispatcher would later say the caller kept whispering, as if the darkness itself was listening, as if the road behind the words might answer back, describing headlights abandoned at the edge of a county highway, an engine still warm, a driver's door hanging open, and the smell oil, dust, and something sharper that didn't belong. By sunrise, the story had already hardened into a headline, and by noon it was on every radio, every porch, every diner table, because this was Texas in 2002, and the idea that a person could vanish into thin air on a straight stretch of road was enough to rattle even the people who swore nothing scared them anymore. The highway ran like a pale scar through scrubland and cattle fence, a route locals drove on autopilot, eyes half closed, radios low, trusting that the road would take them home the same way it always had. That trust shattered when deputies found the car exactly where the caller said it would be, angled toward the ditch, hazard lights blinking in a steady, almost mocking rhythm, as if the vehicle itself were still trying to signal for help. Inside, the keys were in the ignition. The wallet sat untouched on the passenger seat. No blood. No signs of a struggle. No footprints that made sense. Just absence, loud and total, the kind that presses against your ears until you feel it in your chest. The missing person was known here. Not famous, not powerful, but familiar in the way that matters in small communities. A face you nodded to at the gas station. A voice you recognized in line at the bank. Someone with routines so predictable they felt permanent. They had left work late that night, later than usual, enough to be noticed, enough to be remembered later when memory would become evidence. Co-workers recalled a shrug, a tired smile, a promise to finish the conversation tomorrow. Tomorrow never came. Instead, there was a road, an empty car, and a question that refused to stay quiet. By the second day, reporters were calling it a mystery. By the third, they were calling it a cold case in the making. The sheriff stood behind a podium, sweat darkening the collar of his shirt, insisting they were following leads, insisting the public should stay calm, insisting this was not a sign of something worse. But behind the scenes, the investigation already felt like chasing smoke. Dogs were brought in, noses low, tails stiff, tracing a scent that drifted from the car toward the brush and then simply stopped. Search teams fanned out under a sun that showed no mercy, boots crunching over gravel and weeds, voices cracking as hours turned into days. Nothing. No clothing. No weapon. No body. Just the echo of a life that had been there and then wasn't. The community reacted the way communities always do when the unthinkable arrives without warning. Doors locked earlier. Porch lights stayed on all night. Conversations dropped to whispers when strangers walked by. Rumors bloomed fast and wild, fed by fear and the need to explain what logic could not. Some said it had to be an accident, a medical episode, a confused walk into the dark that ended badly somewhere no one had looked yet. Others said it was impossible to disappear without help, that someone had been waiting on that road, watching, choosing the moment. The word predator slipped into conversations like a curse. Detectives tore into the missing person's life, pulling at every thread they could find. Phone records. Bank statements. Old arguments. Quiet resentments. They talked to ex-partners, co-workers, neighbors who had never spoken more than a sentence before suddenly found themselves under fluorescent lights, repeating the same answers over and over until they began to doubt their own memories. Everyone agreed on one thing: nothing made sense. There were no enemies, no debts, no secrets dramatic enough to justify vanishing on a Tuesday night. That, in some ways, made it worse. This wasn't a story with an obvious villain. It was a blank page, and the longer it stayed blank, the more terrifying it became. Weeks passed. Then months. The case cooled the way hot metal does when it's pulled from the fire and left alone. Leads dried up. Tips slowed to a trickle. The headlines moved on, pushed aside by newer tragedies, louder scandals. But here, the absence lingered. The missing person's house remained untouched, mail piling up, dust settling into corners no one had the heart to clean. Birthdays came and went. Holidays arrived heavy with empty chairs and forced smiles. The road where the car had been found became a place people avoided, not because anything happened there again, but because nothing had happened there, and that nothing was unbearable. Inside the evidence room, the case became a box. A physical thing. Reports stacked and labeled. Photos sealed in plastic. Cassette tapes of interviews no one wanted to listen to anymore because they ended the same way, with uncertainty. Detectives rotated out. New faces skimmed old notes, hoping fresh eyes would see what others had missed. They didn't. The mystery resisted structure, refused to align into a narrative that could be solved. It was as if the case itself knew it was unsolved and intended to stay that way. Years went by. Technology changed. DNA databases expanded. Cold case units became a buzzword, a promise that science could drag the past into the light whether it wanted to come or not. Families of the missing learned the language of waiting, of cautious hope and practiced disappointment. They learned how to answer questions from people who meant well but didn't understand, who asked if there were any updates as if updates were things you could schedule. They learned how to live with a wound that never closed because there was no ending to seal it. Every so often, the case resurfaced. An anniversary. A documentary teaser. A new detective giving an interview, careful with words, unwilling to say what everyone else already suspected, that the truth, whatever it was, had sunk deep. Still, the file remained open. Unsolved did not mean forgotten. It meant suspended, waiting for a mistake, a confession, a slip of the tongue, a piece of evidence hiding in plain sight. And then, quietly at first, something shifted. A call. Not the frantic whisper of that first night, but a measured voice, years older, carrying information that didn't fit with the official story as it had been told. A name mentioned in passing. A detail about that stretch of road that had never made it into the reports. The kind of detail you only notice if you were there, or if you were supposed to be there. Detectives felt the familiar, dangerous sensation of hope, the kind that has broken them before, the kind that says maybe this time is different. Boxes were reopened. Photos were re-examined. Old interviews were replayed, pauses and hesitations suddenly louder than the words themselves. Patterns emerged that hadn't been visible before, not because they weren't there, but because no one had known how to look. The road, once thought to be random, began to feel chosen. The timing, once chalked up to chance, started to look precise. The absence, once a void, took on shape. But in 2002, None of that was visible yet. In 2002, there was only a road under a wide Texas sky, a car with its lights still blinking, and a community staring at the place where a person should have been, trying to understand how a life could simply stop. The case did not end with a body, or an arrest, or a confession. It ended with silence, stretched thin over years, a silence that pressed into dreams and lingered in daylight, a silence that waited patiently, because some stories do not explode all at once. Some stories smolder, buried beneath time, until the moment they decide to burn again. In the days after the search teams packed up and the yellow tape came down, the road went back to pretending it was just a road, sun-bleached asphalt humming under passing tires, but everyone who drove it felt the difference, a tightening in the chest, a reflexive glance at the shoulder where the car had been found, as if absence could leave a shadow that long. Investigators kept working, quietly now, knocking on doors that had already been knocked on, asking the same questions in slightly different ways, listening not just to what people said but how they said it, the hesitations, the defensive jokes, the moments when a story felt rehearsed. They mapped the missing person's final hours minute by minute, reconstructing a night that no longer existed except on paper, tracing the route from work to highway to nowhere, looking for the point where the normal cracked open. Phone records became a lifeline and a curse, pages of numbers and timestamps that promised clarity but delivered only fragments. A brief call earlier that evening, nothing unusual. No frantic messages. No sudden break in routine. The last ping placed the phone exactly where the car was found, and then silence, a hard stop that felt less like a technical failure and more like a decision. Detectives argued over it late into the night, coffee cups multiplying, ashtrays filling, one camp convinced the phone had been taken, the other insisting it had been destroyed or abandoned. Both theories led to the same dead end: someone had intervened, or something had happened that no one could explain. Witnesses were scarce, but scarcity only sharpened their importance. A truck driver who remembered slowing down that night, annoyed by flashing hazard lights. A couple driving home from a late movie who recalled a figure standing near the road, posture wrong, too still. Their accounts didn't line up perfectly, and that inconsistency gnawed at the case, raising the question every investigator hates to ask: were these real memories, or were they retrofitted by fear after the fact? Still, detectives logged every word, every gesture, knowing that sometimes truth hides inside contradiction. The car itself was examined and re-examined until it felt like an autopsy. Fibers lifted. Dust analyzed. Fingerprints catalogued and compared against databases that, in 2002, were far thinner than anyone wanted to admit. Nothing screamed violence. Nothing suggested a struggle. The interior was almost insultingly clean, as if whoever left it had done so calmly, deliberately, stepping out into the night with purpose. That image haunted the case, because calm departures don't match panic, and panic is easier to explain. Calm suggests planning, control, a hand guiding events off the map. Rumors didn't wait for evidence. They filled the gaps eagerly, turning neighbors into suspects and coincidences into conspiracies. A local drifter became a favorite target, his name passed around with certainty that far exceeded the facts. An old feud was dredged up, exaggerated into motive. A business deal gone wrong was whispered about in bars, growing more sinister with each retelling. Detectives chased what they had to, but each rumor collapsed under scrutiny, leaving behind only the damage it had done to already fraying trust. The family learned to recognize the sound of official footsteps on their porch, the careful knock, the practiced sympathy. They listened as investigators explained again what they knew and, more painfully, what they didn't. They replayed their own last conversations, searching for hidden meaning, for a warning they might have missed. Sleep came in short, shallow bursts. Every ringing phone felt like the beginning of an answer or the confirmation of the worst. They existed in a suspended state, neither mourning nor hoping fully, trapped between possibilities. As weeks stretched into months, pressure mounted on the department. Editorials questioned the pace of the investigation. Talk radio hosts speculated freely, stitching together theories that made for compelling listening if not compelling truth. The sheriff defended his team, pointing to manpower limits, to the complexity of a case with no body and no clear crime scene. Behind closed doors, frustration simmered. Detectives felt it personally now, The way unresolved cases burrow under the skin, refusing to be set aside. They widened the lens, looking beyond the immediate area, checking similar disappearances, scanning for patterns that might suggest a serial presence. Files were pulled from neighboring counties, then neighboring states. There were echoes, people gone without explanation, vehicles left behind, but echoes are not answers. Similarity does not equal connection, and every tentative link unraveled under closer inspection. Still, the idea took root that this wasn't an isolated event, that the road might have been a stage used before or would be used again. One investigator fixated on timing, on that narrow window between leaving work and being found hours later. He paced it out mentally, imagining every possible scenario: a breakdown, an offer of help, a sudden confrontation. He imagined the missing person stepping out of the car willingly, trusting the wrong voice, the wrong face. That possibility hardened into a working theory, uncomfortable but plausible. Trust, after all, is what roads rely on. You assume the other drivers will stay in their lanes. You assume headlights mean passage, not threat. The lack of physical evidence forced reliance on psychology. Profiles were sketched, tentative outlines of a potential offender who knew the area, who felt comfortable operating in darkness, who could persuade or intimidate without leaving marks. It was speculative, fragile, but it gave the team something to push against, a shape to argue with instead of avoid. Critics scoffed, calling it guesswork. The detectives knew better. Guesswork was all they had. Then came the first false breakthrough. An anonymous tip claimed knowledge of a burial site, a patch of land miles from the highway. Excavators arrived. Cameras followed. The ground was torn open under a blazing sun, the air thick with expectation and dread. They found nothing. No remains. No evidence. Just dirt and the hollow feeling of hope collapsing in public view. The case absorbed the disappointment and moved on, heavier now, more cautious. By the end of the first year, the word cold began to circulate officially. It appeared in memos, in funding requests, in the careful language of reports that acknowledged reality without surrendering. Cold did not mean closed. Cold meant waiting. The file was shelved but not sealed, left within reach for the day when anything might shake loose. That waiting reshaped the town. New families moved in, unaware at first of the story beneath the surface, then gradually inducted into it through half-remembered anecdotes and cautious warnings. Kids grew up hearing about the road, told not to stop there at night, not to trust flashing lights without calling for help first. The disappearance became a cautionary tale, stripped of specifics but heavy with implication. Inside the department, the case became a reference point, a quiet measure of unfinished business. Detectives who had worked it moved on or retired, carrying the unanswered questions with them. New recruits studied it as an exercise, a reminder that not all crimes announce themselves clearly, that some resist resolution no matter how hard you push. The evidence box gathered dust, but it was never far from mined. Years later, when technology promised new eyes, the case would be pulled back into the light, its old assumptions challenged, its quiet corners searched again. But here, in the early stretch after the disappearance, there was only persistence and fatigue, the grind of an investigation refusing to die even as it slipped further from the present. The road remained. The car was long gone. The absence stayed exactly where it had begun, stretching forward, waiting for the moment when silence would finally break, or deepen enough to swallow everything around it. Time did what it always does to unresolved violence, it blurred the edges without softening the impact. By the second year, the case had settled into a strange half-life, no longer urgent enough to dominate headlines, but too disturbing to ever truly disappear. Detectives revisited it in cycles, usually triggered by something small, a new hire asking an old question, a similar case flashing briefly across a regional bulletin, a late-night conversation that circled back to that road and refused to move on. Each return felt heavier than the last, because the longer a mystery survives, the more deliberate it begins to feel, as if it is actively resisting resolution. Evidence that once seemed meaningless was reconsidered under harsher light. The position of the car. The angle of the wheels. The fact that the hazard lights were on, not off. Someone had made a choice there. Maybe the driver. Maybe someone else. Investigators argued about it quietly, knowing that the answer, whatever it was, had consequences. If the missing person turned on those lights, it suggested awareness, maybe fear, maybe a moment of decision. If someone else did it, it suggested staging, a performance meant to delay, to misdirect, to buy time. The road itself became a suspect of sorts. Engineers were consulted. Traffic patterns analyzed. Sightlines measured. It was discovered that at night, from certain angles, the shoulder disappeared into darkness, that headlights could wash out details, that a stopped car might be visible only at the last second. This fed theories of an accidental stop gone wrong, but it also fed darker ideas that someone familiar with the road knew exactly where to wait, exactly where visibility failed, exactly how long it would take before anyone noticed something was wrong. Old witness statements were replayed, their voices crackling through outdated equipment. Detectives listened for what wasn't said. A truck driver's irritation. A couple's vague description of a figure that didn't move like someone in distress. These fragments took on new weight with time, not because they changed, but because the context around them did. Memory, investigators knew, is not a recording. It's a reconstruction, vulnerable to suggestion, to fear, to the stories we tell ourselves afterward. Still, sometimes even distorted memories point toward something real. The missing person's relationships were scrutinized again, this time with less restraint. Early on, detectives had been careful, respectful, mindful of grief. Years later, distance dulled that caution. Old tensions were dragged into the light. Arguments once dismissed as trivial were re-examined for motive. An acquaintance who had been cooperative at first now seemed evasive in retrospect, their timeline too smooth, their recollections too polished. It wasn't enough for charges, not even close, but it was enough to keep names alive in notebooks long after they should have faded. Technology crept forward, slow but relentless. DNA analysis improved. Databases expanded. Items collected from the car, fibers, smudges, skin cells so faint they had once been considered useless, were retested. Each test came back the same way, inconclusive, partial, frustrating. Not nothing, but not enough. The science whispered that someone else might have been there, but it refused to speak clearly, as if guarding a secret it wasn't ready to give up. The family watched this from a distance, their hope tempered by experience. They had learned how progress could feel like betrayal when it led nowhere. They had learned how to celebrate small steps quietly, in private, afraid that public optimism would invite public disappointment. Their lives moved on in appearance, only jobs changed, children grew, years passed, but the disappearance remained the axis everything turned on, the unanswered question that shaped every decision, every future plan shadowed by the possibility of a knock on the door. Then came another tip, this one stranger than the rest. A man called in claiming he had given someone a ride that night, years ago, someone matching the missing person's description. He couldn't remember exactly where he'd picked them up, only that it was late, that the person seemed calm, even polite, not frightened the way you'd expect. He remembered dropping them off somewhere that didn't make sense, a place that wasn't a destination so much as a point along the way. Detectives listened carefully, aware of how memory erodes, but also aware that late recollections sometimes surface when guilt or fear finally loosens its grip. They tested the story. They drove the routes. They checked alibis. The man's account wavered under pressure, details shifting, distances changing. In the end, it collapsed like so many before it, leaving behind the unsettling implication that if the story was false, it was deliberately so, and if it was true, it was uselessly incomplete. Either way, it added to the noise, not the signal. As the years stacked up, the case took on a mythic quality. New theories emerged, some grounded, others bordering on the absurd. Human trafficking. A secret life. A voluntary disappearance so perfect it defied probability. Detectives tolerated the speculation because they had to, because sometimes truth arrives disguised as nonsense. But privately, many believed the simplest explanation was still the most likely, an encounter on that road, brief and irreversible, that ended in violence concealed well enough to last. The absence of a body became both obstacle and shield. Without it, there was no definitive crime scene, no certainty of death, no legal closure. It allowed the case to stay open indefinitely, but it also prevented it from advancing. Prosecutors wanted certainty. Investigators had suspicion. The gap between the two felt unbridgeable. Files thickened. Margins filled with notes. The core question remained untouched. Some nights, detectives drove the highway alone, long after their shifts officially ended. They parked where the car had been found, turned off the engine, and listened. Wind through grass. Distant traffic. Nothing else. They tried to imagine the moment of disappearance not as a dramatic explosion of action, but as something quieter, more mundane, because most crimes are not cinematic. They happen fast. They happen messy. They leave behind confusion, not clarity. By the time a decade passed, the case was no longer just about one person missing. It had become a measure of time itself, of how long a question can survive without an answer, of how a community adapts around a wound that never heals. Children who hadn't been born when it happened were now old enough to hear about it as history, to feel its unease secondhand. The road was repaved. Businesses changed hands. Life moved forward, dragging the mystery with it like an unwanted companion. And still, somewhere in the evidence, in the memories, in the silence that followed that final phone ping, something remained unresolved, waiting. The case was not dormant. It was coiled. It had not given up. It was simply biding its time, knowing that pressure builds slowly, invisibly, until the moment it can no longer be contained. By the time the case crossed its 10th anniversary, it had stopped feeling like an investigation and started feeling like a presence, something that lingered in offices and conversations, something you could sense even when no one spoke its name. Files yellowed. Formats changed. Cassette tapes were digitized, then migrated again as software evolved, each transfer an act of quiet faith that the past could survive translation. The case survived, but it did so unevenly, shedding certainty with every passing year, growing heavier with questions instead. A new detective was assigned to review cold cases that winter, younger than the disappearance itself, armed with fresh training and a stubborn refusal to accept unsolvable as a category. He read everything from the beginning, resisting the urge to skim, forcing himself to sit inside the confusion the original investigators had lived with. He noticed patterns not because they were new, but because they had been ignored, dismissed as coincidence in a case already drowning in uncertainty. Small inconsistencies. Slight changes in witness language. The way certain names reappeared at the edges of the file without ever settling at the center. He focused on geography. Not just the highway, but what surrounded it. Old service roads. Private property lines that had shifted over time. Abandoned structures that no longer existed except in outdated maps and grainy photographs. In 2002, the area had looked different. Darker. Less developed. More forgiving to anyone who needed to hide something, or someone. He cross-referenced timelines with land records, discovering that a nearby tract had changed hands shortly after the disappearance, sold quickly, quietly, without the usual local fanfare. It wasn't proof. It wasn't even suspicion yet. But it was movement, and movement mattered. He reopened interviews where possible, tracking down witnesses who had long since convinced themselves they were done with the case. Age had softened some memories and sharpened others. One witness admitted they had downplayed what they saw because they didn't want to get involved, because they were afraid of being wrong, because they were afraid of being right. Another confessed they had lied about a timeline, shaving off minutes that felt insignificant then but now loomed large. These admissions didn't solve anything, but they shifted the shape of the night, nudging events closer together, tightening the window in which everything had gone wrong. The detective paid particular attention to the missing person's last known movements, not just where they went, but how they felt about going there. Co-workers had mentioned fatigue, distraction, an uncharacteristic quiet at the end of the shift. It could mean nothing. It could mean everything. Stress changes perception. It slows reaction time. It makes people accept help they might otherwise refuse. The detective wondered whether the missing person had already been compromised before reaching the highway, whether the disappearance began earlier than anyone had realized. A long-forgotten piece of evidence was pulled from storage, a grainy security tape from a gas station miles from the highway, recorded hours before the disappearance. At the time, It had been deemed irrelevant. Now, enhanced as much as technology allowed, it showed a vehicle similar to the missing persons, stopping briefly, then pulling away. Nothing overtly suspicious. But the timestamp mattered. It suggested a slight deviation from the usual route, a pause that had never been accounted for. The detective traced nearby locations, looking for reasons to stop there, looking for someone else who might have been present. Names resurfaced. Not new ones, but old ones recontextualized. A local contractor with access to heavy equipment. A former employee with a temper and a history of roadside disputes. None of them had ever risen above background noise because the case had lacked a focal point. Now, they were examined again, not as prime suspects, but as pieces in a broader landscape of opportunity. Opportunity, the detective believed, was the key. Motive could be rationalized after the fact. Opportunity left marks, even if they were faint. The community noticed the renewed activity. Rumors stirred again, quieter this time, edged with skepticism born of past disappointments. Some welcomed the attention, hoping it might finally lead somewhere. Others resented it, wary of old wounds being reopened without the promise of closure. The family watched from the same careful distance, refusing to let hope rise too high, but unable to ignore the subtle shift in tone, the way investigators spoke with slightly more confidence, slightly less apology. Then came a development that rippled through the department with cautious excitement. A partial DNA profile, once too degraded to be useful, matched loosely with a profile entered into a national database years later. It wasn't a clean hit. It wasn't enough for an arrest. But it was a direction, a thread connecting the disappearance to someone who had surfaced elsewhere, someone with a record, someone who had existed outside the town's collective imagination. The name was kept quiet, protected by procedure and prudence, but internally it changed everything. Investigators moved carefully, aware that cold cases have a habit of collapsing under the weight of premature certainty. They studied the match, ran comparisons, looked for corroboration. Travel records. Employment history. Any reason to believe this person had been near that stretch of road in 2002. The trail was thin but not non-existent. A job site nearby. A friend of a friend who owned property along the route. Small connections, easily dismissed on their own, dangerous when combined. They requested new warrants, reopened old lines of inquiry, and for the first time in years, the case felt active in a way that went beyond paperwork. Interviews were conducted under controlled conditions, questions precise, designed to elicit reaction as much as information. The person of interest denied everything calmly, confidently, a demeanor that could mean innocence or experience. No confession came. No dramatic reveal. Just more silence, layered atop the old. Still, something had shifted. The idea that the case might be solvable was no longer theoretical. It had weight. It influenced decisions, budgets, priorities. The road was surveyed again, this time with ground-penetrating radar, drones scanning terrain that had been walked 100 times before. Technology looked where human eyes could not, peeling back layers of soil and time. Each scan that returned nothing was both relief and frustration, narrowing the field while deepening the question. The detective began to understand that the case wasn't resisting because it was unsolvable, but because it was incomplete. Too many pieces were missing, not just physical evidence, but moments, choices, interactions that had gone unrecorded. He suspected that the disappearance hinged on something small and ordinary, a decision so mundane it never made it into reports, a moment so brief it vanished before anyone realized it mattered. Late one night, alone in the office, he listened again to the original 911 call. The whispering voice. The hesitation. The choice to report the car but not approach it. He wondered about the caller, about why they had stayed anonymous, about what they might have seen that made distance feel safer than involvement. The caller had never been identified, their voice never matched to anyone else. The detective flagged it, not as oversight, but as opportunity, another loose end waiting to be pulled. As the investigation gained momentum, it also attracted attention beyond the town. True crime forums dissected every new rumor. Amateur sleuths built timelines, mapped theories, argued fiercely over details they could never verify. Some of it was noise. Some of it, uncomfortably, was insightful. Investigators monitored it quietly, aware that public obsession can generate tips as easily as it can contaminate memories. The family was briefed carefully, shielded from speculation, told only what was necessary. They nodded, thanked the detectives, returned to lives still defined by absence. For them, the case had never gone cold. It had simply learned how to survive in the background, adapting to time the way scars do, fading without disappearing. As the year closed, the detective wrote a report summarizing progress, careful to temper optimism with realism. He acknowledged advances. He acknowledged setbacks. He concluded with a sentence that stood out, not because it promised resolution, but because it refused surrender. The case, he wrote, was no longer dormant. It was active, evolving, responding to pressure. And somewhere, whether in memory, in evidence, or in the silence that followed that final night, the truth remained close enough to cast a shadow, close enough to be felt, but still just out of reach, waiting for the moment when all the fragments would finally align, or fracture completely. Momentum has a sound when it finally arrives in a cold case. It's not loud, not dramatic. It's the low, constant hum of printers spitting out reports, of phones ringing again after years of silence, of doors opening that had stayed closed out of habit more than resistance. Inside the department, the case was no longer spoken about in the past tense. It lived in the present now, pulling resources, reshaping schedules, reminding everyone how quickly the past can demand attention when it decides to. Investigators began to reconstruct not just the night of the disappearance, but the weeks leading up to it, treating time like a crime scene in itself. Financial records were re-examined with new eyes. Small withdrawals that once seemed routine now raised questions. A purchase made days earlier, insignificant on its own, but curious when placed next to a subtle change in behavior. Nothing suggested planning to disappear, but it hinted at distraction, at a mind elsewhere, at pressures never fully articulated to the people closest. They traced social circles outward, mapping connections that had once seemed too distant to matter. Friends of friends. Casual acquaintances. People whose names appeared once and never again in early reports. One name, in particular, surfaced repeatedly in background checks tied to the partial DNA lead. Not close enough to raise alarms back then, but close enough to matter now. This person had drifted through the missing person's orbit without ever settling, leaving behind only brief interactions and a trail that had gone cold long before anyone knew to follow it. When questioned, the individual presented a polished calm, answering without hesitation, volunteering information before it was requested. Experience taught detectives to be wary of that ease. Truth often stumbles. Lies glide. The interview yielded nothing actionable, but something lingered in the room afterward, an impression difficult to articulate, the sense that the conversation had been guided rather than shared. It wasn't evidence. It was instinct, and instinct is a dangerous thing to trust in court but impossible to ignore in a case like this. Parallel to the interviews, forensic teams returned to the physical landscape with tools that hadn't existed in 2002. Soil samples were taken methodically, grid by grid, guided by historical satellite imagery that revealed how the land had shifted over time. Areas that had once been secluded were now developed, paved over, transformed. The possibility that evidence had been destroyed by progress loomed large, a reminder that time is not neutral, it actively erases. Ground-penetrating radar detected anomalies, shapes that broke the uniformity of the earth beneath. Each anomaly triggered careful excavation, each excavation carried out under watchful eyes and held breath. Most revealed nothing more than debris, construction remnants, natural irregularities. But the process itself mattered. It narrowed the unknown. It replaced imagination with data, even when the data disappointed. Media attention returned cautiously at first, then with growing intensity. Headlines spoke of a revived cold case, of new leads, careful not to promise resolution but eager to suggest it. The town responded with a mix of curiosity and fatigue. Some residents welcomed the scrutiny, believing that light, even harsh light, was preferable to silence. Others bristled, uncomfortable with the idea that answers might implicate someone they had lived alongside for years. The family was pulled back into the public eye, their grief repackaged for cameras that framed patience as strength and endurance as closure. They complied because they had learned that visibility was leverage, that stories fade faster than pain. Each interview cost them something, reopened memories they had learned to live around, but they paid the price willingly, because the alternative was invisibility, and invisibility felt too much like giving up. Investigators followed the DNA lead as far as it would go, expanding the search to familial matches, building speculative family trees that reached across states and decades. The process was slow, constrained by legal boundaries and ethical debate. Each step forward raised questions about privacy, about how far the present could reach into the past in the name of justice. The case forced those questions into the open, turning it into more than a single disappearance. It became a test of how much society was willing to excavate to answer old questions. Then came a complication. Another agency contacted the department with information about a similar disappearance years later, hundreds of miles away. Different circumstances. Different victim. But the details aligned just enough to make coincidence uncomfortable. A vehicle left behind. No body. A narrow window of time. The investigators compared notes, cautious not to see patterns where none existed, but unable to ignore the resonance. If the cases were connected, it suggested a mobility, a confidence that had grown with each successful evasion. The possibility reframed everything. The road was no longer an isolated stage. It was one of many. The missing person was no longer alone in their absence. They were part of a constellation of unanswered questions, each disappearance amplifying the others. This realization added urgency but also risk. Serial narratives attract attention, and attention distorts. The team worked deliberately, resisting the pull of grand theories, grounding each move in what they could prove. Late nights blurred into early mornings. Whiteboards filled with timelines and arrows. Coffee went cold untouched as discussions looped back on themselves. Investigators argued, challenged assumptions, discarded weeks of work when it failed to hold up. The case demanded rigor. It punished shortcuts. Every time they thought they were close, it shifted, revealing another layer of complexity beneath. One breakthrough came quietly, almost unnoticed at first. A re-evaluation of the original car examination uncovered a trace overlooked not because it was invisible, but because it had been misclassified. A transfer stain. Small. Indistinct. Now, with improved techniques, it told a different story. It suggested contact. Brief. Physical. The kind that happens when two lives intersect unexpectedly and one changes course forever. The finding didn't answer the central question, but it confirmed what many had suspected all along: the disappearance was not an accident. It was an event shaped by human interaction, by intent or impulse, by a moment that tipped the balance from ordinary to irreversible. That confirmation rippled through the investigation, sharpening focus, narrowing possibilities. As winter settled in, the detective who had reignited the case felt the weight of expectation grow heavier. Progress invites scrutiny. Scrutiny demands results. He knew the danger of pushing too hard, of forcing conclusions to satisfy momentum rather than truth. He reminded his team, and himself, that resolution earned too quickly often collapses just as fast. Still, the case refused to quiet down. Tips increased. Old acquaintances came forward, emboldened by the sense that silence was no longer safe. Some stories contradicted established timelines. Others filled gaps investigators hadn't known existed. Each was vetted carefully, filtered through skepticism hardened by years of false hope. Most went nowhere. A few lingered. The road was driven again and again, in daylight and darkness, in rain and fog, in silence. Investigators tried to feel what the missing person might have felt in those final moments, not as an exercise in empathy, but as a way to locate decision points, the seconds where different choices might have changed everything. They knew this was reconstruction, not reality, but sometimes reconstruction is the closest you get. As the year drew to a close, the case stood at a threshold. It had not solved itself. It had not revealed its ending. But it had changed state. It was no longer defined by what was missing alone, but by what was emerging: connections, confirmations, pressure building beneath the surface. Somewhere, whether in memory or in the earth or in the conscience of someone who had carried a secret for too long, the truth was being compressed by time and attention. Pressure was mounting. And pressure, sooner or later, forces something to give. Pressure changes behavior. Investigators see it all the time. People talk differently when they sense the ground shifting beneath them, when silence no longer feels like protection but exposure. As word spread quietly through law enforcement circles that the case was tightening, subtle changes began to register. Phones that had gone unanswered for years suddenly rang back. Emails arrived late at night, cautious in tone, heavy with implication. People who had once insisted they knew nothing now wanted to clarify, to correct, to add a detail they'd forgotten. Each contact was logged, dissected, weighed not just for content but for timing, because timing, in a case this old, often speaks louder than facts. One such call came from a former co-worker of the missing person, someone interviewed briefly in 2002 and dismissed as irrelevant. Back then, their account had seemed flat, unremarkable. Now, years later, their voice carried strain. They spoke about an argument overheard weeks before the disappearance, sharp words exchanged in a hallway, the kind of conflict everyone notices and no one remembers until it's too late. The name mentioned wasn't new, but the context was. Investigators cross-checked schedules, reconstructed interactions, and realized the argument coincided with a subtle shift in behavior that had never been fully explained. That name led back to a familiar face, someone already hovering at the edge of suspicion, never central enough to confront directly. When questioned again, this time under the weight of new information, the responses were different. Less polished. More defensive. The timeline wobbled. Small contradictions appeared, insignificant on their own, but dangerous in accumulation. Still, there was no confession, no dramatic unraveling. Just the sense of someone working harder than necessary to maintain a story that no longer fit cleanly. Investigators broadened their scope again, this time focusing on vehicles. In 2002, traffic cameras were scarce, records incomplete. Now, with patience and persistence, old insurance claims, maintenance logs, and employment records were used to track who had access to which vehicles and when. One vehicle of interest emerged, a truck reported for minor damage shortly after the disappearance, damage that had been explained away as routine wear. Photos from the claim were grainy but revealing. The location of the damage didn't align with the explanation. It suggested impact, not erosion. The truck no longer existed, sold, scrapped, erased by time. But the owner's explanation was revisited, this time in light of everything else. When asked about the night in question, their certainty faltered. Dates blurred. Details slipped. They insisted they had been home, asleep, alone. No witnesses. No proof. Alibis built on isolation are fragile things, especially when revisited decades later. Meanwhile, forensic genealogists continued their slow, meticulous work. The partial DNA profile was refined, compared, extended through distant relatives who had no idea their family tree was being examined for shadows. It was painstaking, often discouraging, but it narrowed possibilities, turning a faceless unknown into a smaller circle of potential identities. Each narrowing felt like tightening a noose, though no one said it aloud. The media sensed movement again and pressed harder. Investigators pushed back, guarding details that could compromise interviews or taint future testimony. The balance was delicate. Transparency invited tips. Too much transparency invited spectacle. The case had already lived too long in the public imagination to be allowed to tip into fiction. The family was informed of progress in measured terms. Not promises. Not conclusions. Just facts. Confirmations. Possibilities. They listened with practiced restraint, absorbing information without letting it define their expectations. They had learned how dangerous hope could be when it outran evidence. Still, something in the tone felt different this time. Less tentative. More deliberate. It stirred emotions they had kept contained for years. As the investigation deepened, attention returned to the anonymous 911 caller. Voice analysis technology had improved, and although anonymity remained protected, patterns could be studied. speech cadence, regional inflection, stress markers. The analysis didn't reveal an identity, but it raised questions about proximity. The caller had known exactly where the car was, had seen it clearly enough to describe details. Yet they had chosen distance, concealment. Investigators wondered whether fear had driven that choice, or guilt. They canvassed the area again, this time with a narrower focus, speaking to residents who had lived near the highway in 2002, many of whom had since moved away. Some barely remembered the night. Others remembered too much. One recalled hearing a vehicle idle longer than usual, a sound that had blended into the background then but now stood out as wrong. Another mentioned lights in a field where no lights should have been. These accounts were fragile, filtered through years of reinterpretation, but together they suggested activity beyond the roadside, movement off the asphalt and into places less visible. Investigators followed those suggestions, mapping paths that could have been taken unseen, routes shielded by terrain and darkness. The exercise revealed how easily someone familiar with the area could move without being observed, how quickly a person could vanish if guided just a few yards beyond the reach of headlights. It reinforced a theory that had been gaining strength: the disappearance was controlled, not chaotic. Tension built within the team as pieces aligned without locking into place. They were close enough to feel it, far enough to be frustrated by it. Cold cases often die not because answers don't exist, but because the final leap from suspicion to proof is too wide to cross. Everyone involved knew that history. They also knew that backing off now could scatter what momentum remained. A decision was made to re-interview a key person of interest under more formal conditions, this time confronting them with inconsistencies and newly established facts. The interview room was quiet, controlled, the air thick with unspoken stakes. The questions were precise. The pauses intentional. For moments at a time, it seemed as if something might crack, as if the weight of years might finally press too hard. But the person held, offering partial admissions that led nowhere, denying what mattered most. Afterward, investigators sat in silence, replaying the exchange, analyzing tone and body language, wondering whether they had pushed too hard or not hard enough. There was no clear victory, no defeat. Just the knowledge that someone had been rattled, and rattled people make mistakes. Outside, the world moved on, indifferent to the intensity contained within interview rooms and evidence labs. Seasons changed. The highway endured. To most, it was just another stretch of road. To those inside the case, it was a fault line, a place where time had broken and never quite healed. As Part 6 closed, the investigation stood at a precarious edge. The mystery had not yielded its core, but it had begun to respond, to shift under sustained attention. The silence surrounding the disappearance was no longer passive. It was tense, charged, as if aware it was being cornered. And in that tension, investigators understood a hard truth learned only through years of unfinished cases: when answers finally come, they rarely arrive cleanly. They emerge fractured, incomplete, forcing everyone involved to decide how much uncertainty they are willing to live with, and how much truth is enough to finally let the past speak. By now, the case had developed a gravity of its own, bending everything around it, pulling people back whether they wanted to return or not. Even those who had convinced themselves they were finished with it felt the pull, the quiet insistence that whatever happened on that road in 2002 was not done claiming space in the present. Investigators sensed it in conversations that ended too quickly, in doors opened only halfway, in the way certain names still caused rooms to stiffen, even after all these years. One of the most unsettling realizations came slowly, through repetition rather than revelation. When timelines were laid side by side, when interviews from different years were compared line by line, a pattern emerged, not of agreement, but of avoidance. Several people, unconnected on paper, had all minimized the same narrow slice of time, a window no longer than 15 minutes. 15 minutes that drifted in witness accounts, that flexed and stretched depending on who was telling the story. 15 minutes that sat directly between the missing person leaving work and the last confirmed phone signal. Coincidence? Maybe. Or coordination born of shared knowledge, shared fear. Investigators returned to that window obsessively. What could happen in 15 minutes on a dark highway? More than people like to admit. A conversation. A confrontation. A decision to follow, or to stop. The case began to feel less like a sudden disappearance and more like a sequence of choices cascading forward, each one narrowing the path until there was no way back. A breakthrough almost happened by accident. While reviewing unrelated case files, an analyst noticed a familiar name buried in an old arrest report from another county, dated just months after the disappearance. The charge was minor, forgettable on its own. What mattered was the location, uncomfortably close to the highway, and the time of night, matching the pattern investigators had been circling for years. The name was not a stranger. It belonged to someone already tangled in the edges of the case, someone whose explanations had always been just plausible enough to survive scrutiny. When confronted with the overlap, the person reacted differently than before. The calm slipped. Irritation flared, then something closer to fear. They dismissed the connection angrily, accused investigators of reaching, of trying to force unrelated events into a narrative that didn't exist. The reaction was logged carefully. People tell you more with anger than they ever do with denial. Investigators began to suspect that the disappearance had not been an isolated act carried out by a single impulsive individual, but something messier, something involving at least one other person, whether by assistance, silence, or willful blindness. This theory explained the long survival of the secret. Secrets kept alone crack faster. Secrets shared diffuse responsibility, bury guilt beneath collective denial. The anonymous 911 call came back into focus again, this time not as a mystery in itself, but as part of a broader behavior pattern. The call was precise but distant. Helpful but detached. It fit uncomfortably well with the idea of someone who knew more than they admitted but wanted to avoid direct involvement. Investigators traced phone records from public lines, payphones long gone, cellular towers that barely existed then. Most of it led nowhere. One lead, however, hinted that the call may not have been as anonymous as it first appeared, that its origin could be narrowed to a cluster of possibilities rather than an infinite void. At the same time, forensic work continued its slow grind. Another retest of evidence from the car yielded a result that, while still incomplete, strengthened the earlier finding of contact. The transfer stain was now clearer in context. It suggested proximity. A brief struggle or forced movement. Not prolonged violence, but enough to change everything. The implication was chilling. Whatever happened did not take long. It didn't need to. The family was informed of these developments carefully, the way one handles fragile glass. They listened in silence, absorbing the suggestion that the disappearance had likely been violent after all, that the limbo they had lived in for years was not neutral ground but a delayed confirmation of loss. There were tears, but also relief, twisted and painful, that the truth, even an incomplete one, was finally taking shape. Community reaction shifted again. Sympathy hardened into suspicion. People revisited old conversations in their minds, replayed encounters that had once felt insignificant. The town began to fracture subtly along lines of belief and disbelief, loyalty and doubt. Some defended familiar faces fiercely, offended by the implication that evil could have lived so close for so long. Others felt vindicated, convinced they had always sensed something wrong but had lacked the language or courage to say it aloud. Investigators walked a fine line, aware that public division could either loosen tongues or clamp them shut entirely. They kept their focus narrow, disciplined, refusing to be pulled into speculation. Their goal was no longer to explain everything. It was to prove something specific, something solid enough to survive courtrooms and time. A search warrant was executed quietly on a property that had been overlooked for years, not because it was invisible, but because it was too ordinary to attract attention. The land had changed hands multiple times since 2002, each transfer erasing a layer of memory. Ground-penetrating radar flagged nothing definitive, but soil disturbance patterns told a story of alteration, of digging and refilling inconsistent with routine maintenance. Samples were taken. The waiting began again. Nothing was found. No remains. No objects that could conclusively anchor the disappearance to that place. Disappointment hit hard, but it did not kill the theory. It refined it. If evidence had once been there, it was gone now, moved or destroyed during the long years when no one was watching closely enough. The realization forced a darker conclusion into the open. The disappearance had likely been followed by deliberate efforts to erase it. Not panic. Not improvisation. Deliberate erasure requires time, resources, and confidence that no one will intervene. That confidence can only come from familiarity with the land, with the people, with the blind spots of a system not built to see this kind of crime coming. Late one night, reviewing notes alone, the lead investigator wrote a line in the margin of the case file, not meant for reports or courts, but for himself. This case survived because it blended in. The truth, he believed now, was not hidden in some dramatic twist, but in the ordinary, the expected, the things everyone assumed were harmless because they always had been. As pressure mounted, so did the risk. Someone, somewhere, knew exactly how close the investigation was getting. People under that kind of pressure don't stay still. They act. They talk. They make mistakes. And as Part 7 came to a close, the case stood balanced on that dangerous threshold, where silence begins to fracture not from force, but from fear, and where the past, long contained, starts to leak into the present in ways no one can fully control. Fear has a tempo, and by now the tempo had changed. It moved faster, sharper, threading through conversations that once felt controlled. Investigators noticed it in the smallest places, in the way phones were answered too quickly, in the way certain people volunteered alibis without being asked, in the sudden urgency of statements that arrived wrapped in disclaimers and excuses. When a secret senses exposure, it stops waiting. It starts negotiating. The first real fracture came from a source no one had prioritized before. A secondary witness, peripheral for years, contacted investigators not with a confession, but with a question: how much trouble could someone get in for not saying everything back then? The phrasing mattered. It wasn't denial. It wasn't ignorance. It was calculation. Detectives met them in a neutral location, away from offices and uniforms, letting the conversation unfold at its own pace. What emerged wasn't a clean story, but it was real. They spoke of that night as something they had tried to forget, not because they had done something directly, but because they had seen something that didn't make sense at the time and made too much sense now. A vehicle pulled off the road. Another arriving shortly after. Voices carried by the wind. Not shouting. Not calm. Something in between, tense and controlled. The witness had stayed put, watching from a distance, telling themselves it was none of their business, that intervening would only make things worse. By the time they worked up the nerve to move, the moment was gone. The road was quiet again. This account didn't solve the case, but it did something just as important. It anchored the theories in reality. It confirmed that there had been more than one person present. That the disappearance wasn't instantaneous. That there had been a window, however brief, where intervention might have changed the outcome. That knowledge settled heavily on everyone involved, especially the witness, who now carried the delayed weight of a choice made in fear. Investigators corroborated what they could. They compared the account to known timelines, to vehicle records, to the damage patterns they had studied for months. Pieces aligned, not perfectly, but convincingly enough to warrant escalation. The person of interest who had hovered at the edges for so long was brought back in, this time with less courtesy and more precision. They were confronted not with accusations, but with facts arranged in a way that made denial harder to sustain. The interview stretched on. Hours passed. The room grew stale. At one point, the person slipped, just slightly, referring to a detail that had never been made public. It was a small mistake, the kind that might go unnoticed in another context. Here, it landed like a dropped plate, sharp and unmistakable. Investigators exchanged glances. They had been waiting for something like this. Still, there was no confession. Instead, there was deflection, anger, attempts to redirect blame toward unnamed others, toward circumstances, toward misunderstandings. The narrative shifted subtly from "I wasn't there" to "even if I was, it wasn't what you think." That shift mattered. It marked the first visible retreat from absolute denial, the first sign that the truth, whatever its shape, was pressing outward. Outside the interview room, analysts worked furiously to support the momentum. The new witness account was fed into models of movement and timing. Routes were simulated. Sightlines recalculated. What emerged was a scenario both simpler and more disturbing than earlier theories. The missing person had likely stopped willingly, perhaps flagged down, perhaps responding to what appeared to be a minor roadside issue. The interaction escalated quickly, not into chaos, but into control. A wrong turn taken under pressure. A short distance traveled off the road. 15 minutes, accounted for at last. The family was told there was now a credible narrative, one that explained the evidence without forcing it. They listened, faces tight, hands clenched, absorbing the idea that the disappearance had not been some vast unknowable mystery, but a sequence of ordinary human failures, fear, aggression, silence stacked in the wrong order. It hurt in a new way, sharper than uncertainty, but it also grounded their grief, gave it a shape. Media coverage intensified again, driven by whispers of persons of interest and new witnesses. Investigators clamped down harder, aware that leaks could collapse fragile cooperation. The town buzzed with speculation, names passed around cautiously, then with less restraint. Old loyalties were tested. People wondered aloud who had known what, and when. The disappearance was no longer a distant tragedy. It was a mirror held up to the community itself. Under mounting pressure, one individual lawyered up abruptly, ending all informal cooperation. The move was legal, expected, and telling. It didn't prove guilt, but it shifted the landscape. From that moment on, every step had to be measured, every move documented. The case entered a phase where intuition had to give way to admissibility, where the goal narrowed from understanding to proving. Investigators returned once more to the physical environment, this time with a different question. Not where something happened, but where it could have been undone. They identified locations consistent with rapid concealment, places that would have been accessible then and transformed since. Construction records showed one such site had been excavated years after the disappearance, soil removed and replaced without detailed documentation. It was too late to recover anything, but the timing was impossible to ignore. The implication was stark. If evidence had existed there, it was gone now, erased not by chance, but by progress. The case was racing against time it had already lost. Late one evening, the lead investigator stood again on the highway, headlights cutting through darkness that felt thinner now, less absolute. He thought about how easily the road had swallowed the truth, how cooperation and fear had done the rest. He understood now that the case was no longer about discovering what happened. It was about deciding how much could still be held accountable. As Part 8 closed, the investigation hovered in a dangerous space, rich with insight, poor in proof. The story was finally coherent. The motives understandable. The players visible. But coherence is not conviction. Understanding is not justice. Somewhere between those two, the case waited, tense and unfinished, daring the present to do what the past could not, speak clearly enough, loudly enough, to make the truth stick. By now, the investigation had reached the most fragile stage of any long-buried case, the point where everyone involved understands what likely happened, but no one can yet prove it in a way that survives daylight. The narrative was there, solid enough to hold in the mind, but still slippery in the hands. Investigators felt the pressure acutely. Push too hard and witnesses would retreat behind lawyers and silence. Wait too long and memories, already worn thin, would fracture beyond repair. The new witness's account became the spine of the case, but spines need ribs to stand. Detectives worked to corroborate every fragment, chasing secondary confirmation wherever it might exist. They returned to old employment records, discovering that one person of interest had clocked out earlier than reported on the night in question, a discrepancy dismissed at the time as clerical error. Now it looked different. Now it suggested opportunity disguised as paperwork. Another inconsistency surfaced in phone records. A device associated with the same individual had briefly connected to a tower it had no clear reason to connect to, a fleeting digital footprint that placed it closer to the highway than previously admitted. In 2002, such data had been too crude to trust. Now, layered with everything else, it felt deliberate, a breadcrumb left behind by a system not designed to forget. Investigators confronted these findings carefully, aware that confrontation is as much about timing as content. The response was predictable but revealing. Explanations came quickly, too quickly, layered with qualifiers and hypotheticals. The story grew more complex as it tried to stay intact, each new detail introduced to patch a hole, creating another weakness elsewhere. It was the kind of narrative that survives casual questioning but struggles under sustained attention. Behind closed doors, prosecutors were brought in early, a sign that the case was edging toward a line it hadn't crossed in 2 decades. They listened, skeptical by design, poking at gaps, asking the questions a jury would ask later. Where is the body? Where is the weapon? Where is the incontrovertible link between theory and action? Investigators had answers, but not the kind that end arguments. Circumstantial. Compelling. Incomplete. The absence of physical remains loomed larger than ever. It wasn't just an evidentiary problem. It was psychological. Jurors want certainty. Families want finality. The law wants something solid to anchor truth to. Without it, everything floated, vulnerable to doubt. The case had survived for years precisely because it lacked an anchor. Now that same quality threatened to undo the progress made. Investigators searched for leverage elsewhere. Not proof of death, but proof of aftermath. Sudden changes in behavior following the disappearance became critical. One person of interest had moved unexpectedly within months of the event, abandoning a stable situation without clear explanation. Another had sold equipment quietly, quickly, at a loss. None of it was illegal. All of it suggested urgency, a need to shed connections, to simplify life in ways that didn't align with normal patterns. Financial strain was examined next. Bank records showed stress where none had been reported, debts emerging that predated the disappearance and vanished afterward. Investigators questioned whether the event on the road had been spontaneous or opportunistic, whether it had been shaped by pressure that had been building long before that night. Motive, long elusive, began to take shape not as rage or obsession, but as panic, the kind that drives people to irreversible decisions when they believe there is no other way out. The family, informed again of developments, listened with a mixture of grim acceptance and renewed anger. Knowing more did not bring peace. It brought sharper grief, anger at the years lost, at the possibility that the truth had been carried by people they might have known, trusted, passed on the street. Closure, they realized, was not a moment. It was a process, and this was only another stage. Public reaction intensified as details leaked despite efforts to contain them. Online forums dissected every update, amplifying rumors and hardening opinions. Some declared the case effectively solved. Others accused investigators of confirmation bias, of forcing evidence into a convenient story. Both sides missed the point. The truth does not care how it is perceived. It waits until it is proven or forgotten. Late one evening, investigators received a message that cut through the noise. It was brief, vague, sent from an untraceable account. It didn't confess. It didn't accuse. It asked a single question: what happens if someone talks now? The implication was unmistakable. Someone was considering breaking silence, weighing consequences against conscience. The response was careful, restrained, designed to open a door without promising absolution. Investigators knew better than to oversell mercy. What they offered instead was reality. The longer silence held, the fewer options would remain. Time protects no one forever. It only rearranges risk. Days passed with no reply. Tension mounted. Every phone call carried weight. Every unknown number triggered a pause. The case felt alive in a new way, no longer just studied, but reactive, responding to pressure like a living thing. Then came another small shift. A witness, previously firm in their refusal to engage, requested to amend a prior statement. Not retract it. Amend it. The language mattered. Amendments imply correction, not invention. In the revised account, a detail appeared that had never been mentioned before: the presence of a second vehicle leaving the area later than expected, headlights off until the last moment. It was a detail that aligned disturbingly well with the emerging theory. Investigators didn't celebrate. They didn't announce progress. They documented, verified, and waited. This was how cases finally broke, not with explosions, but with erosion, truth wearing down resistance grain by grain. As Part 9 drew to a close, the case stood at its most precarious point yet. The story was tightening. The circle was shrinking. Silence was no longer stable. But proof remained just out of reach, hovering in the space between what people knew and what they were willing to say. The road was still there, indifferent, stretching on as it always had. But the secret it had swallowed was no longer settled. It was shifting now, restless, pressured by time, attention, and the growing realization that some truths, no matter how long they are buried, eventually demand to be carried into the open. The tension changed shape after that amendment, subtle but unmistakable, like air pressure dropping before a storm. Investigators felt it in the way conversations paused a fraction too long, in the way phones rang and no one spoke first. This was no longer a cold case being studied. It was a live thing again, moving, reacting, forcing decisions out of people who had survived for years by making none. The second vehicle became the new axis around which everything rotated. Analysts reconstructed timelines down to the minute, overlaying witness statements with traffic patterns, fuel receipts, weather reports. Darkness mattered now. Headlights mattered. The choice to drive without them, even briefly, suggested intent, not coincidence. It suggested someone who didn't want to be seen leaving a place they should never have been. Old patrol logs were re-examined, not for what they recorded, but for what they missed. A deputy had noted a car pulled over on a frontage road that night, engine running, no plate visible from the angle approached. No citation. No follow-up. The stop had lasted less than 2 minutes. At the time, it meant nothing. Now it became a ghostly marker, a moment frozen in ink that could not answer questions but refused to disappear. The deputy, now retired, was contacted. Memory is a fragile thing after 20 years, but some impressions linger. He remembered the quiet. He remembered thinking it was odd that the driver didn't seem startled. Calm, he said. Too calm. The car drove off before he circled back. No headlights until it reached the highway. A detail that had never made it into the report. A detail that sat heavy now. Investigators mapped the route that second vehicle would have taken, the places it could have gone unseen, the narrow windows where another person might have been picked up, transferred, hidden. They found gaps in surveillance coverage, stretches of road where cameras didn't exist in 2002 and still don't. Texas is vast that way, generous with places to vanish. Pressure built behind the scenes. Prosecutors pushed for something tangible, something they could take to a judge without apology. Investigators pushed witnesses harder, but not louder. They understood fear when they saw it. Fear doesn't always look like panic. Sometimes it looks like cooperation that stops just short of the most dangerous truth. One witness finally broke down during a late-night interview, not with a confession, but with exhaustion. They spoke about the weight of knowing something was wrong back then, about how silence had seemed easier than choosing sides. They described overhearing an argument weeks after the disappearance, voices low, words sharp, the name of the missing person spoken once and then never again. It wasn't proof. It was proximity. And proximity mattered. That same night, investigators received confirmation that a piece of physical evidence long thought lost had been misfiled, not destroyed. A fabric sample, degraded but intact, recovered from a location miles from the original scene. In 2002, it had been useless. Now it was sent quietly to a lab equipped with techniques that didn't exist when the case went cold. Hope is dangerous in investigations, but this was more than hope. It was possibility with teeth. Waiting for results is its own kind of torture. Days stretched. Phones stayed silent. Every hour felt borrowed. Meanwhile, the community buzzed with speculation, the story retold and reshaped with each telling. Some insisted justice was finally coming. Others warned of another collapse, another surge of attention ending in nothing. Both sides underestimated the quiet resolve forming behind closed doors. When the lab report arrived, it didn't deliver certainty. It delivered alignment. Fibers consistent with materials owned by a person of interest. Not unique. Not definitive. But consistent enough to narrow explanations. consistent enough to remove coincidence from the list of viable defenses. Investigators convened again with prosecutors. The conversation was blunt. This was as far as evidence could go without someone talking. The case had reached the edge of its natural limits. From here, progress would depend on human fracture, not forensic advancement. They decided to apply pressure where it would be felt most. Not arrests. Not public accusations. Subpoenas. Financial audits. Renewed scrutiny of unrelated matters. The message was indirect but clear: the past was no longer sealed. Cooperation now would be remembered. Silence would not. One person of interest requested counsel. Another stopped answering calls altogether. A third showed up voluntarily, insisting on setting the record straight. Their statement was polished, rehearsed, filled with just enough detail to sound credible and just enough omission to protect something unnamed. Investigators listened, let the words settle, then introduced contradictions gently, one at a time, watching for cracks. A crack appeared when the second vehicle came up. A pause. A correction. A claim of faulty memory followed by an unsolicited explanation. It was small. But it was real. The kind of mistake people make when they are navigating around a truth they can't acknowledge directly. Meanwhile, the family waited, suspended between anticipation and dread. Every update felt heavier than the last. They understood now that answers, if they came, would not be clean. There would be no simple villain, no single moment where everything made sense. The truth would arrive jagged, incomplete, and it would change nothing about what had been lost. Late one afternoon, as heat shimmered off the pavement outside the station, a call came in that investigators had imagined for years but never truly expected. A voice, shaken, asking about immunity, about what could and couldn't be protected. Not a confession. Not yet. But an opening wide enough to step through. The interview that followed was careful, methodical, almost gentle. The speaker didn't frame themselves as a perpetrator. They framed themselves as a witness to panic, to a situation spiraling beyond control. They described being called late at night, being asked for help without explanation, being told not to ask questions. They described the second vehicle. They stopped short of naming what happened to the missing person. Fear crept into every pause. But the outline was there now, unmistakable. An accident, perhaps. Or something that began as one. A decision made quickly. A body moved. A silence agreed upon without words. Investigators didn't push too hard. Not yet. They knew when to let silence work in their favor. The truth had started moving on its own. For the first time, it wasn't being dragged out of the past. It was stepping forward, cautious but deliberate. As night fell, the road returned to view, illuminated by passing headlights that knew nothing of the history beneath their tires. The case was no longer frozen. It was thawing, slowly, unevenly, revealing shapes that had been locked in ice for decades. Part 10 closed with no arrest, no public announcement, no satisfaction. Only a shift, profound and irreversible. The balance had tipped. The weight of silence was no longer evenly distributed. And somewhere, someone understood that the end was no longer a question of if, but when and how much damage the truth would do on its way out. The interview ended without a signature, without a statement that could be entered into evidence, but it changed everything anyway. Investigators knew that tone matters as much as content, and the tone of that conversation lingered like smoke. Fear had replaced confidence. Hesitation had replaced control. The person who walked out of that room was not relieved. They were burdened, carrying the weight of having stepped too close to a truth they had spent years orbiting at a safe distance. From that moment on, the case moved differently. No longer linear, no longer patient. It began to pulse, reacting to pressure, revealing fractures where none had been visible before. Detectives adjusted strategy accordingly, shifting from reconstruction to containment, making sure nothing leaked too soon, making sure no one had time to coordinate a unified silence. They revisited timelines again, this time with a sharper lens. The second vehicle was no longer theoretical. It had a driver now, a motive adjacent to panic, a reason to answer a call in the middle of the night. Analysts reconstructed routes with that assumption in place, narrowing the search to areas reachable within specific windows. Maps filled with overlapping circles, each one a possible place where something irreversible could have happened. The absence of remains continued to haunt every discussion. Without them, the case still lacked gravity in the legal sense. But investigators began to treat the absence itself as evidence, not of innocence, but of effort. Bodies do not disappear without intention. They are hidden, destroyed, moved. Each option requires time, tools, help. Each option leaves behind patterns, if not proof. Attention turned to land records. Properties owned, leased, accessed in 2002 by people now firmly inside the circle of suspicion. Remote plots. Old wells. Abandoned structures that no longer existed on modern maps. Texas had changed in 20 years. What was once empty had been developed. What was once private had been sold, subdivided, paved over. The landscape had buried its own memory. Ground searches resumed quietly, deliberately. No press. No spectacle. Just methodical examination of places that made sense only now, in light of what investigators believed had happened. Cadaver dogs were brought in under the guise of unrelated training. Soil samples were taken where anomalies appeared, where vegetation grew differently, where the earth looked disturbed in old aerial photographs. Nothing definitive surfaced. No bones. No clothing. No moment of revelation. But the searches weren't failures. They were messages. Anyone watching understood what they meant. The past was no longer protected by distance. It was being dug toward. Meanwhile, the person who had called late at night began to unravel in smaller ways. Financial irregularities surfaced under renewed scrutiny. A business deal from years earlier came back into question. Nothing directly tied to the case, but enough to remind them that cooperation was no longer optional. The law has many doors, and not all of them lead to the same room. Another interview was scheduled, this one shorter, sharper. Investigators didn't chase narrative this time. They focused on moments. Who made the call? What words were used? How fast the second vehicle arrived? Where it went after? The answers came reluctantly, often preceded by silence. But they came. The story that emerged was fragmented, incomplete, but devastating in its implications. A call for help. A belief that something had gone terribly wrong. A decision to assist without asking why, because asking would have made refusal impossible. The missing person was not described as alive or dead. Just not moving. Just already gone, I think. Language chosen carefully, perhaps unconsciously, to avoid crossing a line even now. Investigators let those words hang. They didn't correct them. They didn't push. They knew the importance of letting a witness hear themselves speak truth out loud for the first time. The room felt smaller after that. Heavier. The second vehicle, they learned, did not go directly to a final destination. It stopped. More than once. To think. To argue. To decide what could be undone and what could not. Panic does not create clean stories. It creates wandering, circular movement, people driving without knowing where they are going, hoping that motion itself will solve a problem that cannot be solved. At one stop, something was transferred. Not described in detail. Not confirmed explicitly. But the implication was clear enough to make writing notes difficult. Investigators exchanged looks but kept their faces neutral. This was not the time for reaction. Still, the witness stopped short of naming a location. Fear surged again at that boundary. Legal consequences loomed. Loyalty, too. Silence had been a shared burden for years. Breaking it entirely felt like betrayal, even now. Outside the room, prosecutors listened to recordings, weighing risk. The case was approaching a point where decisions would carry irreversible consequences. Offer limited immunity and risk public backlash. Push too hard and lose the witness entirely. Do nothing and watch momentum die. There is no safe choice in cases like this, only less dangerous ones. The family was updated again, carefully. Investigators chose their words with precision, aware that hope can cut as deeply as despair. They spoke of movement, of cooperation, of things shifting. They did not promise answers. The family had learned not to ask for promises anyway. For them, the passage of time had flattened everything. Years blurred together. Pain had become background noise. What remained sharp was uncertainty. Knowing that people had known, had chosen silence, reopened wounds that never fully healed. Anger surfaced, raw and justified. Forgiveness felt abstract, distant, perhaps impossible. Publicly, speculation reached a new pitch. Anonymous sources whispered about breakthroughs. Commentators debated ethics, arguing whether solving the case now mattered as much as it would have years earlier. Those arguments missed the point. Time does not erase harm. It just spreads it out. Investigators pressed on, drawing closer to the core. They confronted inconsistencies directly now, no longer content to let them slide. One person of interest cracked under the weight, not confessing, but conceding knowledge they had previously denied. They admitted they had suspected something terrible almost immediately. They admitted they had chosen not to look too closely. Admitted that silence had felt safer than truth. Each admission tightened the circle. Each concession made the next one easier, less defensible to withhold. Silence, once shared, became isolating. Those who spoke began to realize that they might be the last ones carrying the full weight alone. Late one night, after hours of back and forth, the witness who had initiated the shift finally asked the question they had been circling since the beginning. Not about immunity. Not about sentencing. But about the family. What would happen to them if the truth came out? Whether knowing would help or destroy them? The answer was honest. It might do both. That seemed to settle something. The witness leaned back, eyes closed, breathing shallow. When they spoke again, their voice was quieter, steadier. They described a place. Not precise. Not enough to put a pin on a map. But enough to narrow the search from thousands of square miles to dozens. A place that had seemed empty. Forgotten. A place chosen because it didn't matter to anyone. Investigators didn't interrupt. They let the description unfold. They asked clarifying questions only when necessary. Directions. Landmarks. Time of year. Weather. Every detail mattered. When the interview ended, there was no applause, no relief. Just exhaustion. The kind that settles into the bones when something long resisted finally gives way. Search warrants were prepared quietly. Plans made. Resources allocated. The operation would be discreet, controlled, designed to avoid tipping off anyone who might still be watching. As dawn approached, investigators stood outside, watching the sky lighten, aware that they were closer to the truth than they had ever been. But closeness does not guarantee arrival. Many cases die within sight of resolution, undone by technicalities, by missing pieces, by the simple fact that truth is not always provable. Still, something fundamental had changed. The story was no longer hypothetical. It had witnesses now. It had shape. It had weight. The road, silent and unassuming, waited as it always had. But the ground beyond it, once anonymous, was about to be examined with purpose. And whatever lay beneath it, whatever had been hidden in haste and fear 2 decades earlier, was running out of time. Part 11 ended not with certainty, but with convergence. The past and present were finally on the same trajectory, moving toward a point that could no longer be avoided. Whether that point would bring justice, devastation, or something messier still remained unknown. But the silence that had protected the truth for so long was breaking apart, and it would not survive what came next. The search began before sunrise, not because dawn offered better visibility, but because darkness invited fewer questions. Vehicles moved in quietly, tires crunching over gravel that hadn't felt weight like this in years. No lights flashed. No sirens cut the air. This was not a spectacle. It was a reckoning conducted in whispers. The location matched the description closely enough to unsettle even the most seasoned investigators. Remote, unremarkable, bypassed by progress and forgotten by maps. The kind of place people pass without seeing, the kind of place chosen not for what it is, but for what it isn't. No witnesses. No memories. No one looking back. Ground teams moved methodically, grids laid out with clinical precision. Every step was measured. Every disturbance documented. The Earth here had its own language, one investigators had learned to read over years of quiet work. Subtle changes in soil density. Vegetation growing at odd angles. Depressions that didn't match the surrounding terrain. Nothing dramatic. Nothing cinematic. Just signals that something had happened and time had tried to erase it. Cadaver dogs were brought in, their handlers tense, alert to every shift in posture, every pause. One dog stopped near a cluster of scrub and refused to move on. Not an alert. Not confirmation. But interest. Enough to slow the team, to mark the spot, to bring in tools that hadn't been needed yet. Digging began cautiously, inches at a time. The earth resisted at first, packed hard by years of heat and neglect. Shovels gave way to smaller instruments. Hands took over. This was no longer about efficiency. It was about respect. Whatever lay beneath had waited long enough. Hours passed. Sweat soaked through shirts. The sun climbed, indifferent. Then a change. A difference in soil color. Darker. Looser. A patch that didn't belong. Silence spread outward from the point of discovery, heavy and instinctive. Everyone knew what this meant, even if no one said it. What emerged was not immediate, not complete. A fragment. Indistinct. Enough to stop everything. Forensic specialists moved in, faces set, movements slow and deliberate. The fragment was documented, photographed, bagged. No declarations were made. But the air shifted. This was no longer speculation. This was contact. News of the find traveled fast within the investigation, slower beyond it. Prosecutors were notified. The family was informed that something had been located, without detail, without promises. They had learned how fragile information could be, how quickly hope could turn cruel. Still, the call left them shaken, suspended between dread and relief. Excavation continued over the next 2 days. Additional material surfaced, enough to confirm what no one had wanted to say out loud. Human remains. Not intact. Not whole. Time and environment had done what they always do. But enough remained to speak, if properly interpreted. Forensic analysis began immediately. Age. Sex. Trauma. Each answer came slowly, cautiously, framed in probabilities rather than absolutes. But alignment was undeniable. Everything matched what investigators had believed for months, what they had feared for years. The missing person had not vanished. They had been placed. The cause of death was less clear. The remains did not offer a single, dramatic injury. Instead, there were signs of impact consistent with an accident, followed by indicators of movement after death. The story suggested by the bones was not one of calculated violence, but of chaos. A moment gone wrong. A decision made under pressure. Panic crystallized into permanence. The witness was brought back in. They had expected this moment and still weren't prepared for it. When told that remains had been found, their reaction was immediate and visceral. Not denial. Not anger. Just collapse. Years of careful distance disintegrated in seconds. They wept openly, shoulders shaking, words failing. Investigators didn't interrupt. They let the moment exist. This wasn't strategy. It was humanity. When the witness finally spoke again, the gaps closed rapidly. Locations were clarified. Actions admitted. Not framed as heroism or necessity, but as regret. A single sentence landed harder than all the rest. I thought if we buried it, it would stop happening. It hadn't. The second vehicle was no longer an abstraction. It was now part of a documented chain, its movements traced not just through data, but through confession. Calls were placed. Arrangements made. Another person of interest was contacted, informed that the case had reached a new phase. Silence was no longer an option. That interview was different. Defensive at first. Dismissive. But denial collapses quickly when confronted with physical reality. When the discovery was mentioned, carefully, factually, the resistance cracked. The story that followed was fragmented, self-serving in places, but consistent where it mattered. An accident. A body on the road. A moment of horror. A belief that calling for help would only make things worse. No one set out to kill. That became the refrain. No one intended this. Intent, however, does not undo consequence. The law does not measure regret. It measures action. Arrests were discussed, then delayed. Prosecutors weighed charges meticulously, aware that haste could destroy everything. This case had survived 20 years. It would not be rushed now. Evidence needed to be airtight. Testimony needed to align. Every step would be scrutinized by defense attorneys eager to frame the past as unreliable, contaminated by time. Public confirmation came quietly. A brief statement. Human remains had been recovered. The investigation was ongoing. No names released. The reaction was immediate and overwhelming. Shock rippled through the community. Old memories resurfaced. Conversations long avoided returned with force. People who had been young in 2002 now explained the case to their children, voices heavy with disbelief. The family was offered the chance to visit the site. They declined. Their closure would not come from standing on disturbed ground. It would come from answers, from truth acknowledged publicly, from the knowledge that silence had finally failed. Behind the scenes, preparations accelerated. Warrants were executed. Records seized. The architecture of the cover-up, such as it was, became visible in hindsight. Not a grand conspiracy, but a series of small choices, each one easier than the last. Each one justified by the belief that the damage was already done. The witness who had come forward first entered protective custody briefly, not out of fear of violence, but fear of judgment. Guilt can be louder than threats. They expressed relief mixed with dread, knowing that cooperation would not erase their role. Investigators did not offer comfort. They offered honesty. Accountability was coming for everyone involved. Forensic confirmation arrived days later. Identity established beyond reasonable doubt. The missing person had been found. The words carried weight investigators felt even as they spoke them aloud. Found. Not alive. Not saved. But no longer lost. The road that had started everything remained unchanged, still carrying traffic, still absorbing light and sound without comment. But its secret was no longer intact. What had been hidden nearby, in a place chosen for its emptiness, had been brought back into the human world, where names matter and stories demand endings. Part 12 closed with a shift that could not be reversed. The case was no longer unsolved. It was unfinished. Charges loomed. Courtrooms waited. And while justice had not yet spoken, the truth had finally broken the surface, dragged up from the ground by time, persistence, and the simple fact that some burdens grow heavier the longer they are buried.